Battleships. Their gigantic guns can hurl deadly projectiles the weight of an automobile against targets more than 20 miles away. They are still among the fastest, largest, and most powerful warships ever to sail the world's oceans. Deep inside the armored hull, men program critical data into a sophisticated central nervous system. Its origins date to the last century. At their command, the guns fire with fearful accuracy. For 100 years, proud symbols of the world's mightiest nations. Great fighting machines that had no equal. Home to that special breed of fighting man, the battleship sailor. Victors and victims in the war at sea. On their decks have unfolded many a turning point in the history of the 20th century. The battleship, long thought unsinkable, indestructible, until the morning of December 7, 1941, when at Pearl Harbor, her mastery of the sea seemed over, eclipsed by the terrible power and accuracy of carrier-based aircraft. Yet she reappears in Korea and Vietnam. And 50 years after the premature report of her death at Pearl Harbor, her weapons echo across the waters of the Persian Gulf. Once again, the battleship is back. This is her story. The 2nd of August, 1990. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait has been met with a swift response. A coalition of Western and Arab nations has created a massive buildup of armament in Saudi Arabia. President George Bush issues a final ultimatum to the Iraqi president: withdraw from Kuwait or face overwhelming force. As 1991 begins, the United States adds the final weapons to the coalition's arsenal. 2 of America's aging battleships will answer the call. For months, the USS Missouri has been making preparations for her third war. Her firepower has been modernized as she prepares to join her sister, the battleship Wisconsin, already in the Gulf. 16 January, Iraq ignores the coalition's ultimatum. 17 January, 1:40 a.m., the crew of the Missouri is at General Quarters.
Execute launch sequence.
Missouri Captain Lee Case.
The Tomahawks, of course, were the first ones launched in the war, and this was the first time that the battleship Missouri entered the modern age with modern weapons. We had never had the opportunity to fire those before, and every one of them worked as advertised.
And the Missouri's basic armament, her 50-year-old 16-inch guns, were fired in anger for the first time since the Korean War. The target was the port city of Khafji, Saudi Arabia. To get within range, the Missouri moved into the shallows. There were only 3 feet of water beneath her keel. Lee Case.
Well, when the big guns were fired in anger for the first time during the Gulf War, a cheer could be heard from one end of the ship to the other. You could hear over the sound-powered phones the excitement of all the people in the plotting rooms. The turret that got to fire the first round, I think, was probably the big heroes of the day at that particular time.
Later, when the ground war to recapture Kuwait began, the Missouri pounded away with her big guns to support the soldiers and Marines ashore. She fired one 16-inch round every 15 seconds, 9 guns firing in rotation, reloaded in under 1 minute per barrel. In just 2 hours, the Missouri had fired 133 rounds. Not bad for an aging lady. But one of the Missouri's most effective new weapons never fired a shot. The RPVs, or remotely piloted vehicles, were the Missouri's own spotters, like the battleship float planes of old. The miniature aircraft featured two camera systems, one for day, the other infrared for night viewing, when they could be most effective. The RPVs were 14 feet long, their wingspan 17 feet. Their computerized controls were operated by a pilot inside the battleship's superstructure. Rocket launched to an altitude of 200 feet in less than 2 seconds, the plane's two-cycle engine then took over. Over the enemy target, the RPV sends pictures and coordinates back to the ship. The pictures are fed into the closed-circuit TV system. An Iraqi food truck stops at a series of bunkers along a road. It is spotted by the cameras of the unheard RPV 1,500 feet above. The positions are fed into the Missouri's computer, and when the big guns fire, they are precisely on target. Proof positive that the 50-year-old big guns can still do their work. For Lee Case, the RPV was the perfect airborne spotter.
So there was a perfect blend of the old and new on board Missouri in the Gulf War, and both the old and the new contributed to our success.
The USS Missouri fights on, America's most historic battleship, the newest technology now grafted to her aging body. Like her battleship sisters, she was born to another time, another place. Far from the Persian Gulf, off the Hawaiian island of Oahu, is the watery graveyard of another great battleship. The remains of some 900 American sailors and Marines still lie within her twisted wreck. The battleship Arizona rests quietly below the peaceful waters of Pearl Harbor. Oil still escapes from her tanks. For this was once a living ship, forever doomed on the morning of December 7, 1941. Dick Fisk was the bugler on the USS West Virginia.
I sounded first call around 5 minutes to 8 for colors. We were looking towards the Arizona and then towards the two mountains there, and then we saw a group of airplanes coming in, and we thought that they were ours.
Dan Martinez is an historian at the Arizona Memorial. On the morning of December 7, 1941, his grandfather was finishing his night shift.
He was walking to his car when the first torpedo planes roared right overhead about 150 feet in altitude. At first he thought it was just a mock battle or drill.
It was no drill. At 7:55 that Sunday morning, the clock began to tick away the final minutes of the battleship era. The great warships were all there, awaiting Admiral's inspection. For the skilled Japanese pilots who had long practiced for this secret mission, the American battleships moored so tightly in a row were a textbook target to which they brought new and terrible weapons of war.
The development of a shallow water torpedo was essential to the success of the attack. The Japanese knew that Pearl Harbor was only 45 feet deep.
American commanders felt secure in Pearl Harbor. They were sure torpedoes required a depth of 100 feet before they could be effective. But they were wrong.
We just took torpedo after torpedo, and come to find out we had actually 9 torpedoes in us.
Equally destructive was the armor-piercing bomb dropped from an altitude of 10,000 feet.
The point of this bomb, with its delayed action fuse, was meant to penetrate inside the ship, then explode.
We were looking toward the Arizona when this whistle come by. It sounded like a freight train, and it landed just forward of the #1 gun turret. I thought that the battleship was most invincible. Nothing can hurt it. 16 inches of armor plating? Ain't nothing gonna go through that.
The Arizona foundered in 9 minutes and burned for 2.5 days. "1,177 men lost their lives on the battleship Arizona that morning. With the death of the Arizona, it seemed, died the battleship itself. For half a century, the universal symbol of naval pride and power. The Americans were stunned by the daring of the Japanese.
I think there was an arrogance on the part of America to understand that the Japanese were capable of these things. Mostly when you read newspapers or magazines of the period, you got the impression that the Japanese were inferior.
Japanese planning was anything but inferior. They had set a secret route across the treacherous northern Pacific and had sent the liner Taiyomaru in advance to be certain no one sailed up there. In a bold effort, they raced toward Pearl Harbor, knowing that they could succeed.
I thought we had the most powerful Navy in the world. What happened?
The sunken Arizona was thought by many to symbolize the end of an era. Today, there are no battleships on Battleship Row. Only the symbols and memories of those once great warships and of the war itself linger on. The Japanese had been planning their attack for over a year. Their war plan had been secretly but actively in operation since the fall of 1941. It included the conquest of Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Malaya. It began with their surprise attack on the Americans. On December 8, just one day after the fateful and tragic attack at Pearl Harbor at the British Admiralty in London, the leadership of the Royal Navy met to debate the future deployment of its 2 warships, Prince of Wales and Repulse, Winston Churchill's personal choice to protect the far-flung reaches of the British Empire. It was the Prince of Wales that just 4 months earlier carried Churchill across the Atlantic for his historic face-to-face meeting with the American president. Symbolically, under the guns of the British battleship, they had signed the Atlantic Charter. Now in the Pacific, the Prince of Wales and Repulse are the lone symbols of Britain's resolve. The question, should these 2 now be rushed to Pearl Harbor? The debate continues throughout December 9. At day's end, they adjourn. The decision will be taken tomorrow, December 10, 1941. But off the coast of Malaya, it already is tomorrow. As Admiralty officials sleep in London, Repulse and Prince of Wales search the sea for a Japanese landing force and are spotted from the air. As at Pearl Harbor 48 hours earlier, the combination of high-level bombers and low-flying torpedo planes is devastating. it will be the first time that aircraft will sink a battleship underway at sea. 840 British seamen lose their lives when the Prince of Wales and Repulse are both sunk. Those who had been debating the future of the two battleships awake to hear the terrible news. British naval historian Eric Grove.
The Prince of Wales and Repulse was very much Churchill's own miscalculation. He thought that a small, fast squadron of capital ships based in Singapore would act as a very potent deterrent to a country that he thought of as effectively a bunch of rather crude yellow men who hadn't really grasped Western technology. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The loss of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse was a tremendous blow to British prestige, self-image, not just Britain itself, the entire empire.
Reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor and virtually alone in the Pacific, the United States strikes back. Her two Pearl Harbor-based aircraft carriers were at sea during the attack on December 7. By the spring of 1942, they had ravaged the Japanese fleet in the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway. At Midway alone, the Japanese lost 4 carriers and over 300 planes. Pearl Harbor had been avenged. In just 6 months, the tide of war had changed dramatically. On July 11, a battleship appears outside Pearl Harbor. She is the USS North Carolina, the first American battleship to be commissioned in 18 years. The largest, most modern of all American warships. It has taken nearly 8 years to design and build her. The North Carolina would soon be in the thick of battle. But on this day, the majority of her crew lined the decks to see the damage kept secret for 7 months. Larry Resin was a 17-year-old seaman aboard the North Carolina.
I looked out and I saw these ships with their broken backs. I saw the Arizona still tilted over, the USS Oklahoma battleship, just the bottom showing, oil all over the place. All of a sudden, there was this cheer from the men on the ships, from the shore, and I said to myself, we haven't done a thing, a damn thing, and they're cheering us.
Ken Hughes was at Pearl Harbor when the North Carolina came down the channel.
What I saw there that day was the most magnificent man of war that any of us had ever seen. This ship meant that we had people, ships, and ammunition coming out of the States that were going to be there in short order and that were going to help us survive.
The North Carolina would fight in every major campaign from Guadalcanal to the bombardment of Japan. She first saw action on 24 August 1942 while protecting the carrier Enterprise. Her performance was remarkable, since at the time she had none of the 40mm anti-aircraft guns with which she would later be equipped. At one point, 6 dive bombers were driven off by her primitive 20mm deck guns, and by day's end she had shot down 7 planes and assisted with 7 more. As the war progressed, the North Carolina bristled with anti-aircraft guns. In her lifetime, the North Carolina's guns served her well. She earned battle stars for 15 campaigns. 9 times she shelled enemy positions ashore. She sank a troop ship, destroyed at least 24 aircraft, and defended American carriers against scores of attacks. In 1942, the North Carolina was a symbol of America's new strength in the Pacific. She would soon be joined by 6 of the 8 battleships the Japanese thought they had destroyed at Pearl Harbor. At Guadalcanal, the carriers Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp were joined by the North Carolina, Washington, and South Dakota. Roosevelt Flinard served aboard the North Carolina.
August 7th, 8th, and 9th, 1942. The North Carolina was a part of a task force that was invaded Guadalcanal. We began firing before daybreak, and we fired several hours. After we bombarded the island a while, then the planes came in for bombardment. We backed out.
The American carrier-based aircraft made certain that the Japanese would not reinforce their positions on the island.
So our role was to protect the carrier from any other carrier planes and other ships that were in the area. Our job in the magazine was to get powder and shells up to the gun. We were sealed in. We were 3 or 4 decks down in this magazine. We would have to really work hard when it was a air attack because the 5-inch guns were shooting bam, bam, bam real fast, and we just had to get the powder up there to them.
The men shut up in the North Carolina and in other battleships during an air attack could track the Japanese planes coming closer and closer by listening to the guns. First the 5-inch, then the more rapid 40 millimeter, and finally the deck-mounted 20 millimeter as the planes that survived came within close range. Fall 1942. The battle for Guadalcanal wears on. The Japanese send one of their most powerful battleships, the Kirishima, to bombard the American air base at Henderson Field. On the nights of 14 and 15 November, between Savo Island and Guadalcanal, the battleships Washington and South Dakota engage in a gun duel at point-blank range with the Japanese force. The South Dakota is severely damaged, and the 4 American destroyers accompanying the 2 battleships are disabled in 20 minutes. The destroyer Preston took several direct hits before she sank. Her combat cameraman, Robert Reed, was thrown into the water. For nearly 3 hours, he watched the action.
It was a duel between the Washington and the Kirishima. The Kirishima was outgunned. Her 14-inchers could not penetrate the Washington's steel-armored belt. The 16-inchers of the Washington did penetrate the 14-inch belt of the Kirishima and spelled her doom. She apparently burned and exploded until she finally went down, according to the battle reports, around 3 a.m. or 3:30.
Throughout 1943, the Allied offensive grows ever stronger. American technology and training overwhelm the enemy. In the fall, the Allies begin the Central Pacific Campaign, a march through the Japanese-held atolls north of the equator, only 750 miles from the enemy homeland. Part of the American effort will rest with a new class of battleships, the Iowa class. The Americans had long been wary of Japanese plans in the Pacific. When 4 years before Pearl Harbor, Japan began to build 3 large battleships, the United States increased the size of its battleships to 45,000 tons, their guns to 16 inches. The result was a new class of battleship, named for the first of their kind, the USS Iowa. More than 5 years in design and construction, the Iowa and the Missouri would be built in the New York Navy Yard, the New Jersey and Wisconsin in Philadelphia. Up to 10,000 people had a hand in the construction of each ship. The Missouri alone required 3 million man-days of work. In recognition of the threat from enemy aircraft, the 4 Iowa-class ships had been designed with an emphasis on the protection of their turrets, machinery, and magazines against aerial bombs. The heaviest armor was more than 6 inches thick. 2 huge belts along the sides were angled inboard to provide protection equal to 13.5 inches of steel. The plates that were locked together to make up the belts weighed 50 tons each. The huge crane was at its limit as it positioned them to be welded in place. Because all of the Iowas entered service late in the war, each was equipped with the newest technology, including surface and air search radar that could track enemy aircraft 100 miles away. Each of the 3 turrets on an Iowa-class ship contained 3 of the newest 16-inch guns, the most powerful guns ever mounted on a U.S. warship. With its improved range, an armor-piercing shell from one of the new 16-inch guns was said to be capable of penetrating 32 feet of reinforced concrete. The Iowas had the greatest anti-aircraft capability of any ship in World War II. Their secondary armament included 25-inch guns in 10 twin mounts and 130 smaller anti-aircraft guns. They were fast and they could cruise great distances without refueling. Their top speed was 33 knots, the fastest battleships in the world. And their range at 12 knots was an incredible 18,000 miles. The new battleships were run by crews of over 2,000 men. The Iowa-class battleships would see action in the Pacific in the closing months of World War II. By 1944, in the Philippine Sea, the fast carriers fighter planes, supported by the battleship's anti-aircraft fire, were destroying the heart of Japanese naval aviation. Now the Americans begin to feel the extent of Japan's desperation. Naval historian Paul Stilwell.
In the autumn of 1944, as the Americans got into the Philippines, the Japanese were so desperate in their defensive stance that they inaugurated the Corps of Kamikazes, planes flown by men who were in effect human fire control systems for the bombs they carried. They were deliberately willing to sacrifice their lives because of the code of the warrior that said dying for the emperor was the highest honor.
The kamikazes' primary targets are the wooden decks of the American aircraft carriers. On 24 October, a force of 259 carrier-based American bombers and torpedo planes attacked 4 of Japan's largest battleships in the Sibuyan Sea. The American pilots concentrate on Musashi as she falls behind the others. After 9 hours of unrelenting punishment, the great Japanese man of war, ravaged by 20 torpedoes and 10 bombs, rolls over and sinks. Oil and debris from the Musashi still float on the water the next day when a Japanese fleet of 4 destroyers, a cruiser, and 2 battleships steam through a narrow strait called Surigao. The Japanese are unaware that at the north end of the strait, the Americans have assembled 8 cruisers, 26 destroyers, and 6 battleships. It is a textbook trap. Ed Snyder was at Surigao Strait.
We had very good intelligence which indicated to us which way the forces had to come. This forced the Japanese forces carrying the amphibious attack, led by some battleships, to come up through a strait, a very narrow strait, so narrow that the battleships could not turn. They had to stay within the channel.
I, as gunnery officer, was tracking the Japanese lead battleship went through the optics of the rangefinder, which in effect was a sight. I had it in the crosshairs, and it suddenly occurred to me that that the pagoda-like mast of this Japanese ship was absolutely filling the optics. We were that close, and as I recall thinking, my God, that looks just like the pagoda mast of a Japanese battleship that I learned about in recognition class back at the Naval Academy. And then I thought, well, that's exactly what it is. And it's shooting back at us.
It was at Surigao Strait that battleships last used the classic formation of crossing the T.
It was a geographical decision, not just so much as a tactical decision, because the Japanese had to come up through the narrow strait.
Crossing the T is a maneuver invented over a century and a half ago. By coming across the enemy's bow, battleships could fire broadsides while the enemy could only fire their forward guns. At Surigao Strait, the Americans crossed the T on the Japanese.
We saw these tracers going through the sky, and they were coming from our battleships and all converging on the Japanese battleships. The battleships that we had backing us up, the Maryland, the California, the West Virginia, the Pennsylvania, the Mississippi, and the Tennessee. What poetic justice that these ships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor are going to go into action against Japanese battleships.
Admiral Yamamoto was wrong to think that he could destroy the American resolve. He was right when he said, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant."
We must remember that Surigao Strait was the last major surface action between battleships. It's probably the last surface action between any kinds of ships that did not involve aircraft. That night, the American battleships, assisted, I like to think, by the attacks of the destroyers, really annihilated the Japanese battleship force.
4 months after the Battle of Surigao Strait, America's great battleships are called upon once again. This time, the assignment is the shelling of the Japanese-held island of Iwo Jima. One of the 8 older battleships is the West Virginia, back from the grave of Pearl Harbor. Her bugler, Dick Fisk, had been transferred to the 5th Marine Division and had gone ashore as an assistant platoon leader.
The big guns was firing their shells into Mount Sorbaji. It was exhilarating because we said, boy, now we got some firepower behind us. We're not alone out here. They're going to wipe this place out.
Larry Resin was aboard the North Carolina.
When they fired the main battery, that's the 16-inch guns where the projectiles are about as tall as I am. If they fire 9 of them at once, 2 things happen. Once, the recoil actually slides the ship sideways in the water. That's a lot of movement. But the other thing, especially in my battle station, you get a sucking out of the air in your lungs. I mean, the vacuum created by the projectiles taking off creates a vacuum.
In March of 1945, only the island of Okinawa stood between the Allies and the Japanese mainland. And Okinawa was fiercely defended. For the Americans and for the Japanese, the battle for Okinawa would be the most costly action of the Pacific War. 75,000 Japanese, 13,000 Americans, and 150,000 Okinawan civilians would be lost. America's battleships were there to prepare the way. The North Carolina and the other 3 ships of the Iowa class, Missouri, Wisconsin, and New Jersey, joined the older but still highly accurate New Mexico and Tennessee. The Allied landings began on Easter Sunday, 1 April 1945. They were accompanied by massive bombardments from the battleships. With the defense of Okinawa, the Japanese unleashed Operation 10 Go, the largest, most concentrated kamikaze campaign yet.
As I'm looking through these binoculars, which are huge binoculars called the eyes on the signal bridge, and I'm looking at this plane coming down as I see the shells coming out forward all around, and then all of a sudden I look in the side of the cockpit and I see the pilot, I see his fixed eyes, and then all of a sudden the wings come off, the explosions occur, the engine evidently catches on fire, and the pilot, with blood ringing down his face, leans over and slumps, meaning he's dead. Yet the plane still keeps coming like a ballistic missile straight at you, straight down. Very fortunately, it missed us by about 100 yards.
Operation 10 Go was truly a massive suicide campaign. The Americans had never seen anything like it. Thousands of young pilots eager to die as human bombs, believing they were part of a divine wind. Thousands of kamikaze planes were shot out of the sky by carrier-based fighters and anti-aircraft fire from the battleships. Still, there were others that found their mark. 33 American ships and 5,000 men were lost to kamikaze attacks during Operation 10 Go. But perhaps the greatest kamikaze mission of all time involved not aircraft, but a battleship, the largest, most fearsome battleship ever built. Four years before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the design for a new and massive battleship was secretly being tank tested in Japan's Kure shipyard. She would be called Yamato, the oldest and most sacred name with which the Japanese referred to their island nation. And she would be the largest, most powerful battleship ever built. A huge roof covered the behemoth. When trains moved past the construction, attendants drew the curtains to cut off the view. Under a shroud of secrecy, the great ship took shape. Nearly 23,000 tons of her total weight was in her armor, a record that has never been equaled. Her largest guns were over 18 inches in diameter, and one single turret weighed more than a heavy destroyer. She carried 12 6-inch and 12 5-inch guns in her secondary battery and bristled with 152 25mm anti-aircraft guns. Her watertight compartments and hundreds of design innovations made her the most glorious symbol of Japanese naval supremacy. But it would all be in vain. 6 April 1945. The battleship Yamato and 9 support vessels steam out of the port of Kure into the East China Sea. She's completely armed, but carries only enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa. Ceremonial sake and prayers are offered to the 2,500-man crew. For this is to be the ultimate kamikaze mission. Yamato is to be sacrificed as the Imperial Navy's face-saving in the final battle of the war. This most powerful battleship of all time is to be run aground, her great guns used as field artillery. At sea, the Americans are waiting. The Suicide Task Force is spotted by a single Grumman Hellcat out 240 miles from his base aboard the carrier Essex. The first wave of planes is ordered into the air. There are 9 American carriers in position. The battleship Yamato will feel the full fury of their bombs and torpedoes. Helldivers, Avengers, Hellcats. Over 400 of them. Even more planes than the Japanese had unleashed at Pearl Harbor. Yamato went down with 2,498 Japanese officers and men. The only record of her final moments are these primitive combat photographs. But one can imagine such horror by recalling the death of another invincible battleship, HMS Barham, when a motion picture camera was there. The mushroom cloud from the Yamato was said to rise so high in the air that it was visible from the Japanese mainland 50 miles away. Yamato had become the symbolic funeral pyre of the Empire of Japan. For 50 years, the battleship had been the world's ultimate weapon, national policy represented by the threat of her powerful guns. The road to 2 world wars began with the creation of the first modern battleship. Work began in 1905 on an entirely new generation of battleships called Dreadnought. HMS Dreadnought would be the heaviest, fastest warship afloat. Her firepower was concentrated in 10 12-inch guns. To protect her magazine, she was wrapped with armor plate 11 inches thick. Below her waterline, 18 watertight compartments made her unsinkable. She carried torpedoes and was the first major warship to run on steam turbines, her 8 engines propelling her at an unprecedented 21.6 knots. Andrew Gordon is an authority on Dreadnought.
Dreadnought laid down the gauntlet to every major naval power in the world. They had now either to build dreadnoughts themselves or relinquish major power status.
Dreadnought changed everything. In America, Japan, and Germany, new battleships already approved were rushed into construction. The word dreadnought became synonymous with the new and more powerful battleships. Amazingly, one of Dreadnought's near contemporaries survives to this day. She is the battleship Texas, launched in 1912. Moored along the Gulf Coast near Houston, the Texas stands as a monument to the thousands of battleship sailors who served with her from 1914 through 2 world wars. The guns on the Texas were controlled by primitive computers. Armor plate on her sides was a full 12 inches thick. Each turret was manned by 24 sailors who lived and worked in dark, cramped quarters. The Texas reminds us of the primitive conditions aboard the first modern battleship. Steve Nelson is an historian and head curator of the Texas.
What makes the USS Texas so similar to HMS Dreadnought are these big guns. Now these are 14-inch guns. The Dreadnought had 12-inch guns. And the way these guns worked was that 2 crew members had to man this loading ramp, drop that down into position. The 14-inch shell was rammed all the way up the breech. 400 pounds of powder was placed in behind the shell. The crew had to grab the ramp again, making sure that it breaks in the middle, closing up. The breech was closed. The crew had to jump into tight confined spaces like this, buckle themselves in, and communicate with their crew members through this voice tube, ready to fire.
Ironically, Dreadnought would never fire her great guns in anger. Yet, within the decade, her existence would propel the world into war. June 28, 1914. The Archduke of Austria and his wife are assassinated by anarchists. The world explodes into war. German submarines attack British merchant shipping. Then on May 30, 1916, the German fleet steams to sea for its first confrontation with England's Grand Fleet. The decade-long arms race approaches Armageddon. The dreadnoughts meet off the coast of the Danish peninsula called Jutland. 250 warships fight the greatest sea battle the world has ever seen. When it is over, 25 ships have been sunk, 8,465 men killed, over 1,000 wounded. John Semita is an historian and authority on the Battle of Jutland, as is Eric Grove. They are at Admiralty headquarters on London's Pall Mall.
The problem to the people who sat in this room was that the battle had not succeeded in gaining the crucial objective, the destruction of the High Sea Fleet.
The battle did succeed in proving that the dreadnoughts were vulnerable. The German reaction was to keep her battleships in port for the remainder of the war. The British had failed to win an overwhelming victory at Jutland because the success of their big guns at long distances in the smoke and haze was only 2 or 3% of hits to shots fired.
The problem for the Royal Navy at the Battle of Jutland was her battle fleet was prepared before the war for a battle that was going to take place at much lower ranges.
The British were working on a system of firing battleship guns at very long ranges. It was based on the work of Arthur Hungerford Pollen, who created a primitive computer before the word computer had been invented.
Pollen developed the idea of using very advanced rangefinders that were gyroscopically stabilized against the motion of his own ship, a very advanced analog computer, very advanced systems of transmitting the calculations of that computer to the guns.
The Pollen system would have greatly improved accuracy, but was too expensive and was rejected by the Admiralty. They'd been informed by their intelligence that the Germans intended to fight at very short ranges. Their intelligence was dead wrong.
This raised huge question marks over the whole way the British Royal Navy did its business. Admiral Beatty was in close contact with the Board of Admiralty who sat in this room. He said, there's something wrong with our bloody ships today and something wrong with our system.
In the closing days of World War I in the Adriatic Sea, an Italian speedboat fires its torpedoes at 2 Austrian dreadnoughts. A combat cameraman aboard the Tagetov watches as 2 milky white tracks head for the St. Stephen. These pictures document the first sinking of a battleship by a simple torpedo exploding below her armor belt, where she was to prove as vulnerable as any other ship. The primitive camera grinds on as nearly 1,000 men are lost. Days later, the war is over. The Allies and their defeated foe gather to set the terms of peace at Versailles. And as Germany's captured high seas fleet makes its way through internment at the Scapa Flow naval anchorage north of Scotland, a secret plan to seal its fate is already in place. On the morning of June 21, 1919, German sailors aboard their captured ships carry out their orders, scuttling 51 vessels, including their prized battleships, rather than hand them over to England as prizes of war. Their rotting remains still litter the bottom of Scapa Flow. As the new decade gets underway, disarmament is the mood of the day. The worldwide focus of attention is on the battleship, that single most